All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to be taking a look at a piece of marketing. It's a very interesting piece of marketing that is for a book called Poetry Master.
Wow.
And it's quite a fascinating piece, really gets you fired up. So I'm very excited to jump into this with you.
Yeah, it is really a kind of call to arms, this piece. It's very different than what we normally look at, which is, kind of dry, scholarly stuff. This is very much like a manifesto almost.
It is. And just to prepare everyone for what they're about to hear, um, there's a lot of exclamation points in this piece. So just buckle up.
Yes, definitely. One of the things I found really interesting here is this metaphor they use of coffee. And they're comparing coffee to slam poetry. And the argument is that both of these things kind of offer this jolt to the system.
I see. So not just like a nice cup of tea, right? This
Yeah.
is meant to really wake you up. It's potent, maybe even a little dangerous.
Exactly, yeah. And they go so far as to bring in Voltaire into this. The Enlightenment philosopher, Voltaire he was, a notorious coffee addict. I mean, we're talking, legend has it, he drank like 50 cups of coffee a day.
Oh my goodness, 50. I can barely handle two. I would be bouncing off the walls.
Right,
Yeah.
but it makes you wonder if there's a connection there, between that intensity and his incredible output as a writer. Was it the coffee? Who knows? But it's an interesting thought.
It is. It is. Well, I'm no Voltaire, but I do like my coffee.
Yeah.
But let's get back to slam poetry, because one of the things that the author says very clearly, very boldly in this piece is slam poetry is not a hug. It's a war.
Uh,
And then they go on to paint these incredibly vivid images, some of which I have to admit made me a little uncomfortable. Talking about burnt churches and invisible monsters yanking your soul out through your ass.
Wow, yeah, I mean, it's hard-hitting, and I think that's exactly what they're going for, is to really shock you, to make it clear that this is not your grandma's poetry.
Right.
This is something very different. And it's interesting because I think what they're doing is they're trying to make this distinction between traditional poetry and slam poetry. Like, they're different beasts almost.
Right. So slam poetry, you're saying it's not. It's not about being subtle or delicate.
No, not at all. This is about raw emotion. It's about visceral imagery. And it's almost confrontational in a way.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to grab the audience's attention by the collar and say, listen to me.
Exactly, yeah. And they really drive this point home by saying something like, the world doesn't remember the nice poets, only the ones who leave a scar.
Ooh, that's a powerful statement. I mean, I can see wanting to be memorable, wanting to make an impact, but do you really have to traumatize people to do that? I mean, that seems a bit extreme.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it does raise questions about the ethics of it all. I mean, how far is too far? When does it become manipulation?
It's like they're saying the only way to get people to pay attention to poetry is to be as loud and aggressive as possible. But I don't know, doesn't that lose some of the beauty of poetry? The nuance, the subtlety?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a real balancing act. How do you create something that is impactful, but also meaningful and without resorting to cheap tricks?
Right, right. Well, one technique that they talk about that they really seem to love is something called the paradox of expectation. And I gotta say, it sounds kind of sneaky to me. Like, are we tricking the audience?
Well, yeah, I mean, in a way, it's about setting up an expectation and then flipping it on its head. They give this example of a poem that starts with, I was 7 years old the first time I saw someone die.
Oh, wow. Okay, so immediately you're hooked, right? You're expecting this heavy story about loss and grief.
Exactly. And then they continue with something like, it was my grandmother. I held her hand. She was peaceful.
Okay, so you're like, oh, this is going to be a tender memory, a reflection on death.
Right, but then, instead of going that route, the poem takes a sharp turn, and it starts describing the grandmother's death in graphic detail.
So it's like they lull you into this false sense of security.
Right, yeah.
And then, bam.
Exactly. And that's the paradox of expectation. It's about creating this jarring shift, that moment of surprise, of discomfort. And that's what they argue makes the poem stick with you.
I get it. But again, it just feels, I don't know, a little manipulative.
It's definitely something to think about. Is it just a tool for creating a memorable experience? Or is it exploiting the audience's vulnerability? It's a fine line.
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, I'm starting to understand why this marketing piece is so intense. It's not just about selling a book. It's like they're selling a whole philosophy of slam poetry, a philosophy that's built on boldness, aggression, pushing boundaries, even if it means making people uncomfortable along the way.
Absolutely. And it's very effective. I mean, you can't deny that. It certainly gets your attention.
It does. It does. And it's interesting how they bring in these figures like Voltaire. It's like they're trying to build this history of rebellious, rule-breaking artists.
Yeah.
And say, look, this is how it's done.
Yeah, there's definitely that attempt to establish a kind of pedigree, I guess, for this approach. You know, to say, look, even Voltaire, a genius of the Enlightenment, was pushing boundaries. Yeah. And it wasn't just with his ideas, right? I mean, the man was mainlining coffee.
Yeah, 50 cups a day. That's hardcore.
But it's clever, right? Because by associating their approach with someone like Voltaire, it's like they're subtly suggesting that if you want to be great, you got to have that intensity, that little bit of madness.
Right, exactly. And I think for a lot of aspiring artists who maybe are feeling insecure or intimidated by the whole art world, this idea of joining this lineage of, you know, poetry warriors can be really appealing.
It's like they're building a brand around this archetype of the poetry warrior.
That.
Someone who's not afraid to challenge the status quo, to provoke, even to offend, if it means making their art heard. Yeah, and that's where that whole sheep versus wolves thing comes in. It's a very classic us versus them tactic.
Right, like you're either a bold, risk-taking wolf or you're just a sheep, destined to be forgotten.
Exactly.
And, you know, gotta admit, it's effective marketing. It really plays on those fears of being ordinary.
Yeah, no one wants to be a sheep.
Especially in the world of slam poetry, where you're competing for attention. You gotta stand out.
Yeah, it's a very competitive world. And this message is saying, if you want to win, you gotta be daring, you gotta be unforgettable.
But is that always the case? I mean, can't you create powerful poetry without resorting to shock tactics?
It's a good question.
I mean, doesn't it risk turning poetry into a kind of verbal arms race where the loudest, most provocative voice always wins?
Right, and I think it all comes back to that question of what is the purpose of art?
Right.
Is it to entertain, to provoke, to challenge, to inspire? I mean, maybe it's all of the above.
It seems like for this author, the most effective art is the art that leaves a scar, that makes you uncomfortable.
Yeah, that makes you think.
Right.
And in the context of slam poetry, which is very performative, very confrontational, this aggressive approach almost makes sense.
So the weapons of choice, then, according to this author, are shock, surprise, and this paradox of expectation.
Exactly.
These are the tools for bypassing the audience's defenses and delivering that gut punch.
Right, and they argue that if you master these techniques, you can become a master manipulator of emotions.
Manipulator, huh? That's a strong word.
Yeah, I mean...
Well, all artists, to an extent, trying to evoke emotions in their audience.
Sure, but where do we draw the line?
Right, where is the line between persuasion and manipulation?
It's a question that's been debated for centuries. And it's not just about art. I mean, we see it in advertising, in politics, even in our personal relationships.
Yeah, we're constantly being bombarded with messages designed to influence us.
Exactly.
But I think as consumers of art, it's important to be aware of these techniques, to be critical thinkers, to ask ourselves, are we being manipulated? Or are we choosing to be affected?
Right. And just because something is shocking doesn't mean it's good.
Right.
We need to be able to separate the shock value from the substance.
So let's bring this back to the book itself. Poetry Master. The author claims it's not just a guide, but a weapon that will teach you to carve your words into your audience's bones.
Wow.
Pretty intense stuff.
It is.
Makes you wonder what kind of poetry they're really advocating for.
Yeah, the language is very evocative, almost violent.
It's like poetry is psychological warfare.
Right.
The poet is battling the audience, trying to subdue them with words.
It raises interesting questions about the power dynamics between artist and audience.
Right. Is the artist a manipulator? Or is the audience a willing participant?
It's probably a bit of both.
Yeah. I mean, as an audience member, you're choosing to be there, to listen, to be open to the experience.
Right. But the artist also has a responsibility to use their power responsibly.
Right. So just because you can evoke strong emotions
doesn't mean you should.
Right.
There's a difference between challenging your audience, provoking thought, and manipulating or exploiting them.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners?
Yeah.
Should they run out and buy this book and start wielding their words like weapons?
I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I do think there's value in considering the points this author raises.
Even if you disagree with them.
Exactly.
So think about what it means to be bold in your art, to take risks,
to push boundaries.
and think about the power of language, how it can be used to create those visceral emotional experiences.
And think about the kind of impact you want to make with your art.
Right. Do you want to leave your audience shaken, or do you want to leave them inspired, moved, connected?
These are questions every artist should be asking themselves.
And I think that's the real value of this deep dive. It's not about endorsing one approach. It's about encouraging you to think critically about your own creative process. It's funny, though, like, even though they're pushing this super intense, almost like militaristic approach to slam poetry, I think they accidentally hit on some truths about creativity in general.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that focus on boldness, taking risks, and really connecting with your audience on a gut level, that applies to any art form.
Right, right. And that's where I think the coffee metaphor actually comes full circle. It's not just about the intensity, the jolt. It's about the process, the transformation.
Exactly. Like, think about it. You start with these raw coffee beans. They have potential, but they need to be roasted, ground, brewed. It's a whole process of refinement to bring out those flavors.
Right. And you end up with this complex aromatic drink that can be, both invigorating and comforting.
Exactly.
And it's kind of the creative process itself, right?
Yeah, totally.
You start with this raw idea.
Yeah.
An emotion and image.
And then you have to shape it, mold it,
right,
refine it.
Until it becomes something you can share. And just like with coffee, there are different levels of intensity. You have your light roasts, your dark roasts.
Your blends, your single origins.
Right, so maybe it's not about being a wolf or a sheep. Maybe it's about finding your own blend, your own voice.
Yeah, finding your own way of connecting with your audience.
Exactly.
Not every artist is going to be comfortable with that. Aggressive, confrontational style.
Right.
And that's totally fine.
Yeah.
The important thing is to be authentic.
Right.
To create art that comes from a genuine place, whether it's a whisper or a roar.
I love that. Right from the heart. That's
Right.
really what it comes down to, isn't it?
I think so.
But I do think there's something to be said for pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone.
Absolutely. Trying new things.
Right. Taking risks.
Experimenting.
That's how you grow.
Exactly.
But I think that's where this marketing piece kind of falls short.
Mm-hmm.
They tell you to be bold, to be a wolf, but they don't really offer much practical advice. It's all about shock value and aggression, but not so much about the craft itself.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, just throw a bunch of shocking images together. See what happens. But creating really powerful art, it takes more than that. It takes skill, intention,
Right.
a deep understanding of your craft.
So for our listeners who are interested in exploring slam poetry or any kind of creative writing, what would your advice be? Should they try to become these verbal warriors?
I would say take inspiration from anywhere you can, but don't feel limited by any one approach. Read widely, experiment with different styles, and most importantly, write from the heart.
Right from the heart.
Yeah, don't be afraid to be vulnerable, to share your truth, even if it's messy or uncomfortable.
And in the end, isn't that what connects us? Our shared experiences, our emotions,
Absolutely.
our vulnerabilities.
Yeah, and whether you're a seasoned poet or just starting out, your voice matters.
It does.
Your story matters. And the world needs to hear it.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into this quite intense piece of marketing for Poetry Master. It certainly gave us a lot to think about. And maybe it'll inspire some of you to approach your own art with a renewed sense of purpose and intention.
I hope so.
All right, that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll catch you next time. Be creative, Stefan.